Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. I recently completed my PhD in psychology, neuroscience, what have you, from the University of Oxford. And in today's video, we're going to talk about dopamine. Before I proceed, I do want to stress that this podcast or this episode is separate from my work at the University of Oxford. All right. So if you have ever felt motivated to go and get things, then chances are that dopamine was involved. If you have ever felt like you are somewhat addicted to something, whether it's like full blown addiction where you just can't help yourself, or if it's more of the mundane day to day style of addiction, like when we check our phones, and that also is probably running on dopamine. So dopamine is this molecule that we all are run by essentially, and if we want to understand ourselves, if we want to perform better, if we want to get a handle of our dopamine, then one important thing that we need to understand fully is dopamine. And so in this video, we are going to talk about dopamine, and it's going to be a very comprehensive, hard hitting video that covers the latest science, the neuroscience of dopamine. I will try my best to present all the latest science, but do so in a manner that is accessible and easily reachable. So hopefully you will have fun. So this is what we're going to cover in today's video. We're going to cover, first of all, let me just get this in focus. We are going to cover what is dopamine. So what is dopamine? We are going to cover what it does, and just get this here. We're going to cover how to use it. So how to use it for our benefit. So this is the plan for today. We're going to cover what is dopamine. We're going to cover what it does. We're going to cover how to use it. Now, if you are watching the live stream, I think today what we're going to do is just this, which is we're going to cover what is dopamine, and it's by no means a trivial thing to answer. It's no means a simple thing. But hopefully we'll get some sort of an overview of what is dopamine from today's thingy. All right, to start with, dopamine. All right, so to start with, dopamine is a neuromodulator. Now, what do we mean by that? Well, let's start with the fact that all of us have brains. And some people think that some people don't have brains, but believe it or not, if you're a human, you have a brain. And what that brain is made up is what's called neurotransmitters, or just these molecules. So again, if I draw a picture for you of what's inside your brain. So if you take a brain and if you zoom inside a brain, what you will find is what are called neurons. So they look something like this. These are like cells in the brain, but brain cells have like a special name and they're called neurons. So they will have like a cell body. Then they will have what's called an axon. And then they have these sort of weird things coming out. And obviously this is just a pictorial representation of what a brain cell looks like. And then, there's also some things on the side. So that is how like one brain cell might look like. It's called a neuron. And then there's obviously lots of them. Oh, I see my neuron is written outside. So let's write it again here, neuron. And so that's one neuron, that's one brain cell. And so obviously there's not just one brain cell in the brain, there is other brain cells that connect to this neuron, let's say. And this is a very bad neuron here, but never mind. So let's say there's another neuron that goes somewhere like that and like that. And so what you see there is there's this gap between two neurons. And this sort of a gap is what's called a synapse, first of all. Synapse. And in these gaps is where dopamine is released. So this is how neurons effectively talk to each other by, releasing these molecules between them. And this is where dopamine is released. Dopamine is released, right? Obviously, this is completely pictorial representation of dopamine. So these molecules that are in between two synapses, they are called neurotransmitters. But when there is a molecule that is present and diffused all across the brain, we often call it a neuromodulator. And that's because it seems like, it's like something that modulates activity across various parts of the brain, and that's why it's often called a neuromodulator. Okay, let me just check on what's going on with the live stream there. Cool. All looking good. Great. So so now we know what a neuromodulator is. Good. So now that we know what a neuromodulator is, and dopamine is a neuromodulator, now the question is, where does dopamine come from? Now, interestingly enough, a lot of people think that dopamine just magically appears. And while, of course, we don't actively eat dopamine, we do eat something that dopamine is made up of. So we do eat. So while we don't, how do I say this? So while we obviously do not magically make up dopamine, we do not eat dopamine, we do not have packets of dopamine that are sold, we do ingest the raw materials that eventually becomes dopamine. So if you do stop taking the raw materials, then chances are that you will not produce dopamine. Now, of course, your body will sort of alert you and you will instinctively go for these. But know that we do eat the raw material for dopamine, which is called tyrosine. And tyrosine is just a component of protein. So if you do eat your protein, then what you're also doing, among, of course, many, many other things, is providing the raw materials for your brain to make dopamine. And so there are parts of the brain which we'll talk about where dopamine is made, but know that there is a raw material that you and I are actively eating that is supporting this production of dopamine in your brain. And this raw material is tyrosine. In fact, if you are one of those kind like me who is into going to the gym and you consume protein powder as a supplement, then if you look at the back of the protein powder, you should be able to see as one of the components of what this particular protein powder is made of, is tyrosine. So if you look at the label at the back, you should be able to see a tyrosine there. All right, so we'll talk a bit more about how do you increase dopamine or how do you use all of this information for our benefit. But the purpose for this segment is just to develop an understanding. Without understanding the science, we are not going to be able to understand dopamine. So if you want to enhance your dopamine, if you want to enhance your motivation, then I invite you to understand the science first, because otherwise there are no prescriptions about what dopamine does or what it is. And it's hard to like just say that this is exactly what you should be doing. Okay, cool. So good, we are all recording. So again, if you are watching the live stream, what I'm doing here is recording a video on dopamine, and it's going to be a long video, so we're going to split it up, and I'm recording the behind the scenes as we do it. If you have questions, I might be able to take it at the end. Okay, good. So we covered tyrosine, dopamine, and so now is like quite interesting because we're going to cover where in the brain this is all made. So let me press record. Okay. So now that you understand that you actively ingest the raw materials for dopamine, the question now is, where in the brain is dopamine produced? And so now that you know that, ting, ting, ting. So now that you know where dopamine is produced, So now that you know that you ingest the raw materials to produce dopamine, we're not going to talk about where in the brain is dopamine produced. So we're going to go deep inside the brain, and we're going to talk about what happens in the brain and what is the neurochemistry of dopamine in the brain, or which parts of the brain are responsible for the production of dopamine. So the first part of the brain which creates dopamine is this region called the substantia nigra. And I'm going to show you a photo of the substantia nigra in a bit, so do not fret. But this region called the substantia nigra, and do not worry about the terminologies too much. I'm just giving you the names in case some of you might want to go deeper. But all you need to know is this is like a very tiny region at at the top of your brainstem. So if you imagine a brain, um, I think I'm gonna just show you a real photo in a bit. So I'm gonna not draw it, but there is a region called the substantia nigra, which is part of your midbrain. So if you think about the brain as a deep layered structure, so substantia nigra is a part of the brain deep inside the brain. By the way, if you're live and any of this is unclear, it would be fun if you tell me, because that means I can re-record things. Cool. All right, so now that you know that we ingest the raw materials for dopamine, but we don't actually ingest dopamine directly, the question then becomes, where in the body is dopamine made? And the dopamine is produced primarily in the brain in these two regions called the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. Now, I hope these names don't scare you. They are just names after all. And you'll find that the naming is not super random either. But again, remember, this is a science video, so we are not shying away from using names, but know that they are just parts of the brain. So I'm going to show you a photo of the substantia nigra in a bit as well on a brain scan. But just to build the intuition, let me draw a toy brain here. So this is like the brainstem. And by the way, this is what's called the cerebellum. And there will be like the cortex, and it goes something like that. So that's what a brain looks like. So the substantia nigra is the first region where dopamine is produced. You'll find it somewhere here. Of course, this is not localized, and you'll find another region of the brain which is called the ventral tegmental area, which is here. So this is substantia nigra. So the cross is substantia nigra, and this thing is the VTA, the ventral tegmental area. And understanding these is kind of important because they do produce dopamine, that is correct, but they also send projections to different parts of the brain, and these projections do different things. So it's important to sort of maintain and understand that these are important nuclei in the brain if you were to understand motivation, if you were to understand learning, and so on, which we'll talk about in the second section. But this is the substantia nigra, this is the ventral tegmental area, and I think time has come to show you a real brain scan with a photo. So hopefully you can see on the screen where these are actually located. So this is an image of the brain, and in the red is highlighted the ventral tegmental area, in green is the substantia nigra, and it's not very clear in this image, but the reason why the substantia nigra has this name is because niger, I think it's how it's said, is Latin for dark. And when you look at a slice of the brain, you will be able to see a little bit of a darkened area. And that's why this region has nigra in its name. Now this is I won't be able to show you a photo, but I can invite you to Google substantia nigra slices or real brain, and you will be able to see real photos of the substantia nigra, and you will be able to see that darkened part in the middle of the brain. Perhaps taken after surgery, or I mean, I don't know where the photo comes from, but you will be able to see it on Google. I can't show it to you here for copyright reasons. Okay, so and by the way, ventral tegmental area also has this name coming from the tegment, which I think means roof, and that also is supposed to be like the roof of the brainstem, which is this long thing that projects out. So this thing, it's like at the roof of this long thing, and that's why it's called the tegment or ventral tegmental area. Okay, good. So now that you know that there is the substantia nigra and there's the ventral tegmental area that produces dopamine in the brain, what happens is they also send projections, meaning they send neurons to different parts of the brain. So these are what's called dopaminergic pathways, meaning these are paths like highways in the brain where dopamine is used. So the substantia nigra sends its projections to this part of the brain in the front called the striatum. So let's call it the striatum here. The ventral tegmental area sends projections to the front of the brain in the prefrontal cortex, and it also sends its projections to other parts of the striatum. So I'm going to call it also the striatum for simplicity's sake. I mean, they do have more complex names, but for now we're going to just call them the striatum. So that's like the three main pathways of dopamine. So just to revise, we have dopamine synthesized in the brain, produced in the brain, with the substantia nigra as being one of the key regions where that is done, and the ventral tegmental area. And then there are neurons, which is another word to say brain cells, that project out of these nuclei, these brain regions, and they go to many parts of the brain in roughly the front, right? So these pathways, these three pathways that I just drew, they have a name. So let me get back there. These three pathways that I just drew, they have a name. So the one that goes from the substantia nigra, this is called the nigrostriatal pathway. So boy, will I write all of this? I will. Striatal pathway. The one that goes from the VTA to the front of the brain, it's called the mesocortical pathway. And the one that goes to the striatum is called the mesolimbic pathway. So you can think of it as the limbic system, like it's sort of inside the brain, which is often called the limbic system, where all the reward stuff will happen. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But these are the three main pathways that dopamine works in. Now, at this point, I must say that these are not the only pathways in which dopamine operates. So there are other highways, if you will, that are also present in the brain, but these will be the three main ones we are going to talking about. And in fact, for the purposes of addiction, we are really going to zoom in, and the purposes of reward and all of these things that we know about dopamine, we are really going to zone in on this last one called the mesolimbic pathway. And you will be surprised as to how much we know about this pathway and the kinds of beautiful discoveries that we have been able to make about this pathway. So we're going to touch a little bit on the other two, but primarily when we talk about what dopamine does, we're going to talk about the mesolimbic pathway. But now just to quickly tell you what these three do, because you perhaps don't want to wait for this whole section to start, the nigrostriatal pathway is often involved in movement. So if you have ever heard of Parkinson's disease, which is often thought of as a movement disorder, it's a bit more nuanced than that, but you will see symptoms of Parkinson's where people have tremors and they are not able to hold their own quite often while walking. They shake uncontrollably often. It is thought that Parkinson's disease is essentially a loss of dopamine neurons in the nigrostriatal pathway. So we are sort of overlapping a little bit with the part where I'll tell you what dopamine does. And a lot of people think of dopamine as pleasure or learning or motivation, but a lot of people do not know that dopamine is quite heavily involved in producing movement. And in fact, it might even make sense to some extent when we think about motivation. It's hard to have motivation without like movement, right? So there is perhaps some analogous idea behind it. Although, we are going to go much more specific and we're going to talk about specific studies in a bit. So you'll get a better idea. The mesocortical pathway. So anything that goes to the front of the brain, and again, to remind you, this is this pathway that goes right to the front of the brain. So anytime we are talking about things going to the front of the brain, we are probably in the territory of what's often called as higher order function. So think of it that things that only humans can do, or only higher order mammals like monkeys and chimpanzees can do. So the front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, it has special types of cells that only high order mammals have. In fact, that's often the distinguishing factor of higher order creatures, is they have this prefrontal cortex which supports things like decision making, which supports things like planning, which supports things like integrating various information from various different sources. It supports things like what's called metacognition, where you're sort of monitoring your own brain state, or you're monitoring your plan, or making like how confident you are about certain things. All of this happens in the prefrontal cortex. So these pathways tend to talk with the prefrontal cortex and are involved in decision making and so on. So I'm going to park these pathways for now, because in the next section where I talk about what dopamine does, we're going to really zone in on the mesolimbic pathways, which is if you've ever thought of dopamine as rewarding, or if you have ever heard of dopamine as giving pleasure, chances are they are talking about the mesolimbic pathway. So we're going to talk about mesolimbic pathway in extensive detail, citing various studies and looking at various studies on what it does. Okay, good. So I think this section was all right. Fine. Alrighty. Okay, good. So, by the way, if you're looking what I'm doing, I have like these notes to check on what I am supposed to record today. None of it is scripted, by the way. I never script things. So this is just a sense of what I need to record today and what I need to get through. So this was a bit of an introduction, and I think for today I'm going to stop here. Hopefully you learned something about dopamine. For those on the live stream, let me just quickly recall what we did. So the point of this video is to talk about what dopamine is, what it does, and how to use it. So today we're going to tick this part off, and we talked about the fact that you have a brain, and the fact that you have cells in your brain called neurons, and these neurons are not physically connected, but they have a small gap in between, and in this gap is where your neurotransmitters go. Dopamine is one of a neurotransmitter, and it's better called a neuromodulator, because this thing is present all across the brain and is diffused all across the brain. So anyway, neurons, synapse is the gap between these two neurons. Dopamine is a neuromodulator. And then we talked about where dopamine is made in the brain. So there are these two regions called the substantia nigra and the ventral tegmental area. Substantia nigra denoted by this cross, VTA denoted by this thing. And the substantia nigra sends projection to the sort of front of the brain, forebrain, I think is the technical word. And the VTA also does the same to another part of the similar region. And then there is a projection that goes right up to the front of the brain. Now, fun fact, this is BTS for you guys, which is there are dopamine cells even in the eye, even in the retina. There are dopamine cells in the hypothalamus, which is often thought of regulating your body and your internal states. So by no means is dopamine just present in parts of the brain which I just mentioned, which is these three pathways. And there are also other parts of the brain, like the hypothalamus is somewhere here. That's where also dopamine is present. Cool. And then finally, we covered Well, no, that is it. Actually, that is all we covered today. Well, I did talk about where dopamine is also comes from, which is the food we eat. So tyrosine is the raw material that is required to produce dopamine in the brain, and so that's where dopamine comes from. So that was, I think, good enough for today. How long have I been going for? 34 minutes. Not too bad. Not too bad. Um, is there anything I could talk about? I think what I'll also quickly share in like so I'm also figuring out what should I do on these live streams. And um one of the things that I could do is talk about some recent neuroscience I've been reading. So I'm just trying to pull things up, and just to give you a sense of what's happening in the field, and like while I'm here might as well do it. So 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 just pulling up a paper. So this should be copyrighted. Okay, let's do this. Let's try how this works. So what I'm going to do also to see what we can do in these live streams is talk about some recent neuroscience that I have been reading. Is going to be very casual and quick. Well, my hope is I haven't lost the live stream here. Let's see. La la la. I hope I'm still live. Oops. Go live. Am I still live? Okay, there you go. I think I'm still live. So I accidentally closed the tab where YouTube was open. I hope it is resilient to my mischief. And if not, then I am back. Okay, cool. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is just to augment this live stream a little bit and create a little bit of a show, I suppose, is going to talk about some recent neuroscience I've been reading. So if everything is correct, you will be able to see my screen when I do that. That clearly works. And so I'm going to pull up this article. I'm just going to quickly have a look at the copyrights. CCBYND, meaning I should be able to attribute this paper to the right people, which I shall do. Okay, so I think you should be able to see my screen. I'm going to very quickly confirm. You can indeed see my screen. It can be a little dark, but that's all right. I think we can deal with this. Okay, cool. I think that's just like the color profile thing, which we'll fix in some other time. But anyway, so this is the paper so discussed in a journal club here. So I was quite thinking about this quite a lot. It's by Eleanor Spence, Neil Burgess, people from UCL, or at least the work is done at UCL. And I think that should be good enough for my copyright duties. And so we can now try to think about what this paper is doing. So if you are new to science, then you might not know that science operates with papers, meaning people write and publish papers, and other scientists look at their discoveries and try to understand what's happening, and this is how knowledge itself is created. So in this paper, what they're trying to do is make a connection between the brain and large language models. And okay, that's not the exact intention. The exact intention is to try to formulate how memory works and how we things like forgetting and all of those happens, and try to create like a representative model of how that might happen. But a lot of people get a little bit discouraged and worried when they see something like this. So let me just give you a bit of a preamble before I try to sort of summarize what this paper was doing. The preamble is mathematics is extremely important. And if you want to understand science in its depth, if you want to really understand neuroscience, and I'm not talking just like pop culture neuroscience where someone just uses scientific words, someone just uses parts of the brain as just to add credibility to what they're saying. I'm just trying real science. And to understand real science, we need to understand mathematics. And the reason for that is because the brain is effectively a computer. And the reason why we know that also is because we know how these neurons work. So if you remember this one, well, not this one, this scene, if you remember this scene, these neurons, these are basically computational units, meaning they can compute stuff by, sending and receiving messages. They're not too different. Well, of course, these are biological, but they are analogous to silicon chips. So the chips on your computer, which are also doing small computations and talking to each other. And when you stack a lot of these chips together, that's where you get things like software. That's where you get things like algorithms. And something similar is happening to the brain, except the brain is not purely a silicon. Well, it's not at all a silicon device, but it's not just purely electrical either. It's electrochemical. So that's what your brain is. So the dopamine is the chemical bit, and then these neurons have what's called action potentials, which again we're not going to get into, but that's the electricity bit. So now, knowing that the brain is effectively a computer, we can use tools from computer science to understand the brain. And in fact, the relationship also goes often the other way around, where we can use the brain to inform things in computer science. If you look at things like ChatGPT, these large language models, they are based on what's called neural networks. And there's no coincidence that it comes from the word neurons. Now, it's important to not draw like too deep a connection between those two because they're only loosely inspired by that. But it just gives you a sense of there's like a interplay. There's like a conversation happening between neuroscience and modern AI and artificial intelligence and computer science and whatnot. So now coming to the paper that we discussed and I was looking at this week. So what this paper does is effectively what it's saying is there's this part of the brain called the hippocampus, which you can see here. And there's the part of the brain called the frontal cortex or cortex, which you can see highlighted here. And what the authors were trying to say is the memories are possibly, well, not possibly, the memories are definitely stored in the hippocampus. And we know that not through this study, but through many other studies on the hippocampus. And the memories seem to be integrated, meaning, we form our understanding of the world. Just checking if I'm recording. Oh, okay. I'm not recording here, but I'm live streaming. So much to juggle. But anyway, so the integration of these memories, the how we make sense of them, what we infer from them, how does it inform our future? All of that seems to happen in the cortex. Now, at this point, we don't know where exactly in the cortex, and most likely it's going to be like a network, not like a specific region or whatnot. But this is the level of granularity in which we can understand things right now. And then the claim is if you have like a generative model, which is to say something like a large language model like ChatGPT or Mistral or what have you, then you can think of it as your brain, the front part of your brain or the outside part of the brain, the outer part of your brain is working like a bit of a generative network. And the inner part of the brain in the hippocampus is working a bit like a memory storage, which stores your memory in a bit of a compressed format. So that compressed format, you can think of it as, like when you take an image, when you store it in a computer, it's often compressed. It's not like every single pixel is not stored, but there is some sort of an algorithm, the JPEG algorithm, which compresses it so that the file size is reduced. And a similar thing happens in the brain because obviously there's a lot to remember. And this sort of compression works a little bit like RAG. And, you might totally lose me at this point if you don't know what I'm talking about. But if you know anything about AI, retrieval augmented generation is how, a lot of these LLMs have memory, in which, the large language models themselves don't have memory on their own, but they can use like a storage unit. Think of it like, when you have a website, there's a server where, your files are stored, your images are stored, and then there's some sort of a compression, there's some sort of an algorithm which helps you store them effectively, and then you can retrieve them. And when the retrieval happens, that's sort of led by the outer part of the brain, the cortex. And that seems to be a model which does explain behavior quite well. So not going to go again too much into details because it's probably going to be a bit too much. But what you can see here is probably a good example because it's a pure example. Is when we start, we may have these elaborate memories that, Melody's parents surprised her with a trip to the aquarium and whatnot. And then Melody took a nap in the aquarium, which is not a normal thing or a regular thing to happen, right? So what the hippocampus might be doing, again, the part of the brain that's on the inside, which might be storing a gist of this story, but it might be also storing some details. Like Melody took a nap, which might not be too common. And then you will see like this sort of a compression happen that at this point, all we are seeing is the trip happening to the aquarium. So, you're not seeing the extraordinary elaborate thing because perhaps a lot of these things are common. Like, you go in a car and that's not too uncommon, and which you might be generate from your own model that you already have. But so you're also just storing the gist and you're storing the details. So anyway, this is like a computational / theoretical paper. I don't think I'm going to go too much into detail. If you want to read more, you have it on the screen. You should be able to find it. But that's it for today, I think. And yeah, if you have any questions, you can join for the next live stream. And the idea will be hopefully to keep doing this every now and then. Okay, I'm now showing you my YouTube screen, which is what I should not do. All right, so thank you for joining me. Hope you learned something about dopamine in today's live stream. The hope and desire is to keep doing these live streams where I will do some recordings and shoot some behind the scenes. And then hopefully I'll also have some element which is spontaneous, something that I can record on the spot, and something that will add a little bit of value to you. So stay tuned for the dopamine video where we'll synthesize all of these things. So next week I'll come back and talk about the other two bits, which is what dopamine does and how we can use it. What dopamine does is really the meat of everything. So hopefully you'll join me for that.